Hi, everyone. So I don't actually plan on taking a whole lot of your time with this video. Instead, I want to say a few things to preface the material we're going to cover this week, and to set up a conversation that you can all have that will start on the discussion forum and then move into class. Our agenda for this week is to talk about governance and how it relates to development. And overall, our goal is to talk a little bit today about governance and what has come to be known as the good governance agenda, um, mainly through the emergence of global civil society and institutions committed to international development, like the Bretton Woods institutions. Um, some critiques or some ways of thinking about that, and then to begin a series of conversations that we're going to have over the week relating to taxation, what to do about corruption, and then how to address development itself. So how we should conceive of it, given what we know about the developing world. I haven't put together a PowerPoint slide presentation because what I'm actually doing is I'm working from my notes. And just to remind you, you do have access to my notebook, the one that has all my lecture notes in it, via a link provided on the Canvas page. And also, the assumption here is that by working through the skeletal notes, you'll have already sort of put yourself in a position um, to talk about most of these concepts. So, the main interest we have today is this idea of governance and its relationship between rentier states and the role of accountability and corruption. And what we mean by a rentier state, I'm just going to state out indirectly, is a state that doesn't have the same kind of taxation institutions or capacity as developed states. So in countries like the United States, the state's ability to function emerges from its ability to tax effectively and efficiently. Effectively in the sense that it can actually capture revenue and then use it to create public goods, and then efficiently, which is a far more complicated idea, that it does so by supporting and not undermining markets in their ability to provide economic growth. Um, what's interesting, though, is that good governance has become a really integral part of how we think about the developing world. We tend to think about aid and its goals, and the effectiveness of it in terms of a state being able to govern itself well. But as Fukuyama, our sort of current old friend, has pointed out, no one really has a clear understanding of what that means. And there's no definition that clearly encapsulates what it is to be a state that is governed well. And what that means is that we have a really important disjuncture. We have a concept and a set of expectations. We want to create circumstances under which states in the developing world can govern themselves. They can govern themselves well. There's an inherent normative evaluation in there. But we don't actually know what that means, but we are sort of motivated by this concept and it shapes how we engage with the developing world. So, um, institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF, have made good governance a particular part of their policy agenda, but even they have sort of murky understandings of what the concept means, and it's not the only way of determining or defining that term. And it's important to note that this concept really grew out of the emergence of international activism and an increasing interest in civil society, more or less in the late 1980s and 1990s. Um, so when we talk about governance, we can usually talk about it having both political and economic elements. In its economic dimension, we're talking about things like property rights, transparency of economic interactions, freedom of information, and management of the public sector. The idea here is that governance functions well when the state responds to people's input, is transparent in its actions, and is effective. It provides the things we want the state to provide. There's also a political dimension that we're usually assuming here. Refers to legitimacy, a state that actually enjoys the support of the people it rules, support for human rights, the rule of law, and accountability. And one way of organizing this is to think about it as states that govern themselves well are effective in the sense that they provide the public goods and economic growth we would expect a state to provide, and that the rules for political power in the system reflect democratic and responsible politics. Now, that sounds fine in some sense until you start talking about, okay, so how do we accomplish this? And an important critique of development thinking in the emergence of the good governance agenda has been that it's just simply too broad, too complicated, and encompasses too much. Um, it means everything, and in some sense doesn't mean anything. Um, it's impossibly broad, according to many critics, in the sense that we don't prioritize what is important, and instead of trying to theorize different causal passageways, which would allow us to pragmatically and piece by piece build toward good governance, we expect it all to function at once. And this has something to do with the concept of liberal peace and liberal peace building that we talked about last week. We don't actually even really have a really strong conversation about what the development or movement toward good governance would look like. And this is the Fukuyama point. Instead, we know what it should look like in the round all at once, and we try to create it all at once. And what that tends to mean is that states are never really effective. Because we want them to sort of transition very rapidly and to make progress on all these indicators at the same time, they just pragmatically can't do that. And we end up sort of pushing our involvement further and trying to crib more and to take more away and to do more at the international level, and that might be counterproductive. And it may not be motivated by a really strong understanding of the context or the nuances involved. Which leads us to a concept that maybe good enough governance is better, in the sense that maybe it's not a matter of turning every state into a responsible, democratic, and effective state overnight, but to sort of realizing that progress in the right direction should be our goal, and it should be our more medium-term goal. We should think more incrementally. But even here, we have a series of problems, namely two. The one is that, well, if we're going to move incrementally, where should we start? Do we start with the inputs of politics or the outputs? In the sense that, for inputs, do we start with the nature of power? Do we start at the level of identity, nationalism, democratic institutions, society and civil society, the capacity to act? Do we focus there and push empowerment in democratic processes to try to ensure the right rules of the game are in place? Or do we focus on output? Do we actually think more about whether a state can provide order and economic growth, and then move on from there toward leveling the playing field? Because if we try to do both at once, I think you can start to see how this gets really complicated. And we've already sort of been implicitly having this conversation in some ways throughout the semester. So theories about empowerment and social and human development would really push the input side of politics. Whereas theories like modernism, revisionism, the politics of order, even encapsulated in Dambisa Moyo's TED Talk and even her book, would really point to that other output side of politics. So I said that there were two considerations here. The other one is the difference between economic growth and wider concepts of development. So here, again, we've implicitly having this conversation specifically as it relates to the difference between social or market-based development. And here, the idea is, okay, so should we start with just creating economic growth and the responsible institutions that requires? Or do we need a broader understanding that sort of encapsulates something like human development? And human development is a broader concept used by the United Nations and other key bodies to try to encapsulate a broader sense of what is necessary for a state to develop. So it does require economic growth, but it also requires addressing things like inequality, social difference and isolation and fragmentation, the quality of an engagement of civil society. So in some sense, I think the idea here is, do we start with sort of economic growth or institutional capacity, or do we start with a broader sense of we need to try to get everybody pulling in the same direction? A case in point, and this is where we'll start to move into the conversation, and I would like to see you sort of develop your own perspectives, is that when we talk about capacity, is it enough for a state to simply be able to enforce rules and provide services, even if that state doesn't necessarily look the way we want it to? A case in point here could be taxation. The capacity to tax is a key element of state power. So, for those of you who've taken 210 or are taking 210, you know that a key element of the state is its ability to provide the public goods and services its people expect of it. Um, and that requires the ability to tax effectively, which is to say, remain legitimate to the point where people will actually freely give their money. They won't try to avoid taxation. Um, that they can actually collect the money, so they actually have the bureaucratic resources and the effect and the capacity to manage the economy in a way that makes revenue creation visible and therefore taxable. States that aren't really good at actually keeping track of what's happening inside their borders are really poor at taxing because they don't know who's making what money. And also the ability to know how to tax effectively. So this is a hallmark of what allows a state to function well, which would mean we would expect it to be something we would see and relate to development. But there's a broader consideration here in the sense that we really want to create economic growth and state management of the economy, but that's difficult unless there is accountability. And in the developing world, as we talked about, many states in the developing world are actually extractive states that don't have some of the institutional capacity that I was just referring to. They're not really good at keeping track of populations. They're not really good at using money to create public goods. Instead, the holdovers from colonialism are a series of institutions that are really good at extracting resources and selling those resources. When you factor in the point that the developing world is full of states that are rich in natural resources, things like oil, rare earth minerals, even gold and silver, an extractive state, therefore, does not necessarily need to tax. It can get the funds it needs to keep itself stable by extracting what are called rents. Rents are, to provide an economic term, the financial or economic benefit you accrue from owning something and that is scarce and then providing access to it. So when you say, some of you might be thinking about rent in terms of like what you pay to live in an apartment, and it's the same concept. The landowner, your landlord, owns a scarce resource, which is housing. They don't provide it for free. They extract a rent. So your rent not only goes to paying for the building itself, maybe the landlord's mortgage, their maintenance fees, it also pays a fairly substantial profit because that accrues from their ownership of the apartment and nothing else, right? So your rent would cover some things and it would go beyond that to provide this profit. That's a rent, right? Somebody owns something that somebody else wants and they will accrue some benefit simply from owning it. When we talk about rentier states or rent-seeking behavior, it's states that are reliant on extracting rents from their sale of rare resources like oil. And rent-seeking is a form of politics where states actually don't really work to be economically effective. They don't really focus on making their economy efficient. What they focus on is creating circumstances where they can extract rents. So when a state has high rent, so an oil state or a petro state, what the state can do is it can actually get the resources it needs to remain in power from those rents and controlling that market rather than being responsible to its population, which is required if they were going to tax them, or by providing economic growth. So one of the examples of this is what we do call in political science, in comparative politics, the resource curse. So lots of countries that on paper are very rich, states like Venezuela, who have large bodies of oil, which are very valuable. There should be a lot of rents created by this. They tend not to develop all that effectively because they don't need to tax. And because they don't need to tax, institutions are not put under pressure to be legitimate. They're not put under pressure to be transparent or effective. And that creates a weakness in the state. So coincidentally, the more money a state makes from something like oil, the less likely it may be for them to develop. So in short, rentier states may not have the same capacity to operate effectively because they don't maintain legitimacy or directly tax. Um, Now, the answer to this, and this is where the conversation will go in the discussion forum, is to say, okay, then, well, what do we do with that? And what's fascinating is that this is where your own argumentation needs to come in your weighing of different considerations, and of course, the details of particular cases, which we're going to go to next. But even thinking theoretically as we are today, one of the things that comes out is, so how do you address that? How do you address developing a rentier state? Do you focus on making their institutions specific and force them to create in capacity and deliver things, right? Or do you start with the nature of power? Do you push them to change how the state is organized? These can have different effects. And one of the things I'd like you to do in the discussion, which you can tell from the discussion question, is to reflect on this to some extent and think about how we would address rentier states and rent-seeking behavior on the part of developing countries.